You teach at Johns Hopkins, which had a number of realists in the past, Robert Osgood and David Kaleo. Someone like Kaleo, I think, would probably take issue with some of your contentions. Namely, if I remember correctly, Kaleo wrote extensively on the U.S. in the 19th century and argued that it actually wasn't that different from Imperial Germany, which embarked upon 3 wars to consolidate itself and result in the reunification of Germany in 1871. And Kaleo argued that American behavior in the 19th century actually wasn't that different, that we were a militarized society that was intent on conquest and actually in expansion. And that's what occurred. So what would you say to that?
Well, that's a very good point. David, the late, alas, David Kaleo was a great scholar and a good friend and wonderful colleague for more than 2 decades. And he wrote a book called The German Problem Reconsidered, which you as a German scholar know well. And in it, he argued that there wasn't anything special about Germany, even German imperialism, that the Germans were trying to do what other countries had done. The United States being one with its continental expansion, Russia being another with its expansion across Eurasia, Britain and France also being examples when they acquired empires in the 19th century. David argued that Germany's misfortune was not that it was any different or worse than other countries, but that it engaged in imperial behavior in the wrong time and at the wrong place. And its imperial behavior, which went more or less unchallenged by other countries, caused 2 world wars. It was a controversial thesis, and I have some reservations about it, but David made some very good points, as he always did. I would say that in David's other work, he wasn't a strict realist, as strict realists themselves would identify themselves, because David studied contemporary Europe. He wrote a lot about the European Union. He was a great champion of the European Union. And the willingness of the European great powers, at least in Western Europe, to set aside their centuries-long quarrels and join together in an economic union which has become increasingly a political union, defies realist wisdom. So in that sense, I think David would be more on my side than on the side of the realists, although as a capacious scholar, he took from different traditions what he thought was appropriate.
So you just argued that elites, that we have not had a tradition of small elites guiding American foreign policy, say as you've had in Germany or Japan. But isn't that contradicted by American history in the 20th century, at least? That you had the formation of the Inquiry Commission with Walter Lippmann in 1917, when America had entered the war, and trying to draw upon elites, academics, and so forth to devise a plan for post-war Europe. You have the rise of the so-called wise men after World War II, the so-called establishment, which comes to grief in the Vietnam War. You've had the neoconservatives. You can debate the extent of their influence, but another elite phenomenon. So doesn't that contradict your contention that elites have not actually had the overriding influence and that the public has actually not influenced American foreign policy that much?
Well, you make a very good point, and I think I would put it that it supplements my point. Elites in the United States, as in other countries, have had a disproportionate role in formulating and initiating foreign policies. We don't take a plebiscite for every foreign policy that the United States carries out. That's, I think, more or less inevitable. Where the public has been more important in American foreign policy than in the foreign policies of other countries is in passing judgment on and ratifying or overturning those foreign policies. And we see that in what is generally the most important foreign policy of all, namely war. Elites have started wars, But the American public, when it was not satisfied with the course of those wars, has forced their discontinuation. And that's been particularly marked in the 20th century. The public turned against the Korean War, forced President Harry Truman, who was presiding over it, to step down, or at least not to run for a third term, which was then constitutionally permitted, and really impelled Dwight Eisenhower, his successor, to find a negotiated end to the war. It was also true in the Vietnam War, which President John Kennedy initiated. President Lyndon Johnson presided over it. The country turned against it. It forced Johnson not to run again for president. His successor as the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, was defeated by Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon was in effect under orders from the public to wind down the war, which he eventually did. It was also true of the Iraq War, which became unpopular. President George W. Bush started it, presided over it. He was succeeded by a Democrat, Barack Obama, who did his best to bring the American participation in the war to an end. Incidentally, Americans have turned against war in the 20th century, not because they disagreed with the goals for which the wars were being fought. Americans always believed that keeping South Korea out of communist control and South Vietnam away from communist domination and trying to make Iraq a peaceful democracy were worthy goals. But as those wars went on, the American public decided they'd become too expensive, and most importantly, expensive in American lives. And so they said, through their votes to the American government, you have to stop this, and the American government did. So it might be said for foreign policy in the United States, the executive branch, the elites, propose, but the public disposes. The elites say, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it. And the public says, we'll decide whether that's okay or not. You show us that it works according to our standards, and we'll be okay with it. But if it doesn't, you're out of here, and somebody else will have to come in and clean up the mess.
Is the root of the issue, and I think you make a good point, but is the root of the issue that these wars have been inefficacious, that we simply, in Richard Hofstadter's words, Uncle Sam has cried uncle?
Yes, that's true. But Uncle Sam has cried uncle not because the other side prevailed militarily, but because Uncle Sam made a cost-benefit calculation and decided that the costs were exceeding any benefits that might accrue. The combined forces of China and North Korea in the Korean War could not defeat the American army. The Vietnamese communists could not defeat the American army. The insurgents in Iraq could not defeat the American army. But they could exact casualties to the point at which the average American said, this isn't really worthwhile. And incidentally, the public was able to say that because these were not wars of existential consequence for the United States. Getting out of those wars did not bring the military forces that the United States was fighting to American shores. That is why there was public tolerance for significant casualties in World War II, because the stakes seemed so high. And that was true for a while in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was seen as fighting terrorism. And on September 11, 2001, terrorists had actually attacked the United States. It wasn't true for Iraq, and therefore the public had less patience for Iraq than for Afghanistan.